All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are coming from. Thank you so much for being here, being tuned in to the very first Conversations with Kia. This may become a series, but I had to do something to be with my good friend. I had to make up something. So we're going to do this really amazing conversation. But I really created this because I wanted to have these type of conversations where we could talk about complex, uncomfortable, or transformational issues or topics in a real casual format, right? We're all in our own homes or virtually in some environments. So I'm excited about the potential for this to be a new series. If you are joining, which I know that there are so many of you that will be joining us live today, make sure that you like, share, and comment. Leave your comments below so that our guests today can answer them right here on air. At what other time will you have an expert who can answer these questions? And she's not charging me and she's not charging you. So we're going to take advantage of this good wisdom that she has for us. So if you're unfamiliar with my work, I really work to help leaders and communities and organizations and systems to make some improvement. And so that looks like a variety of things in a variety of ways. But what I realized at the core of my work is that it was hard to make those improvements because people were unhealthy or traumatized or neglected. They didn't understand cultural awareness. And so that made my job harder. And that was pre-COVID. And so then we get into COVID and the experience that we're in today. And I realized that this conversation needed to happen. So many of my colleagues are talking about a variety of things in the diversity, equity, inclusion space. But one area I had not heard was really talking about it from kind of the laws of justice, if you will, or what's happening in the legal industry. It was really important to me to bring on our amazing guest today. So before we get too formal, I want to do a few little things. So I've got Phillis Rambsy with me of Rambsy Law. Of course, she is also branded in the back, so you see that. So go to her website, RamsyLaw.com. You see how to spell it there on the screen. Make sure that you Google her, follow her on all the social media platforms. Please make sure that you know who she is. But before we get into that, I want to kind of do a little segment of like, what's the tea? So I've got my little tea mug here. And so what's the tea happening in your world? So I'm going to start it off with a couple of questions, but feel free to tell me whatever the tea is. What I know of you is that you have a lot of shoes. And anybody who kind of knows you really well or who even reads your website would know that. So I want to know how many shoes, what's the favorite pair of shoes now in the pandemic? And then anybody who knows you also knows you love a good whiskey. So what is the favorite whiskey during the pandemic? So let's just start right there. It's almost lunchtime. People can get their own glass of whiskey or tea. Maybe you don't know which one I got, but tell me what it is that you are rocking and what is it that you're sipping?
So as far as shoes, like everything, the pandemic changed me.
Right. Yeah.
Meaning that if you know me, you know I always had on heels. I had on heels to go to the grocery store. If I was going downstairs to check my mail in my building, I had on heels. And then March hit and a pandemic, and there's really not a lot of reason to walk around your house in heels.
Well,
for the first time ever, probably since I was a kid. I mean, in my adult life, I had sneakers to work out in, or maybe one or two pair if I was going on a vacation that required walking. I bought my last pair of shoes that I bought actually got here like March 12th or whenever we shut down. Last pair of heels.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So since March, I've only bought sneakers. So I call myself a sneakerhead.
Okay, cool. Okay, awesome.
I counted yesterday. I think I had like 8 pair of sneakers at the door, which if you know me, I don't ever think I had 8 pair of sneakers at one time in my life. So
yeah. So, and then what are you drinking?
Anything brown. That has not changed. It will not change. I'm trying to cut back on it because I do believe I'm holding hope that we will be past this thing and then it'll be bikini season. And I'm a woman over 40, so I cannot have all that extra liquor because it goes straight to my stomach. But anything brown, some days you just need a little brown. So my bar is still full. My shopping list is Clorox wipes, Lysol, and brown liquor. If I got that,
the essentials.
Take it.
All the essentials. So if you're tuning in, you're listening to Phillis Rambsy of Rambsy Law, and she is here. We're going to talk about how to protect yourself and your rights within the workplace. But I have to start with, something fun and something a little light. I also think, as a Black woman, it's important for me, kind of Black woman to Black woman, to check in with you. How are you doing during this pandemic?
Good days and bad days. I think like everybody else. I have days when I am so optimistic. I have days when I'm relieved to be at home and not on the road a lot. As you know, I practice here and in the DC area, so I traveled every week almost. So there are some days that I say, oh wow, it feels good to rest. It feels good to not have to go to the airport every week. But it's incredibly depressing. I have known people who have died from the virus. I've known so many people who've had the virus. I've known people who have lost their jobs, who are just struggling, who are scared. In my own life, I can't see some of the people that I love, and I'm a social person, as you know. So I was the kind of person that would throw a party together in 5 minutes, and now to not be able to see family, see friends, that's hard. That's hard. And I think that we all need to recognize that our humanity requires that we recognize this is hardship. This is not normal. So when people say, oh, let's just carry on like normal, this is not normal. You do not normally wear a mask every day. You do not normally have to not hug people or do this as the hug. So it is not normal. Our humanity requires us to mourn. It requires us to recognize the hardship, but our humanity also requires us to hold out hope. And so at the end of each day, I don't try to even get overly religious about it or overly spiritual. I just say, this is what I'm hopeful for today, or this is what I'm thankful for. If I can get to the end of the day and say, today I'm thankful because I do not think I came in contact with anybody with the virus, basically because I stayed in the house all day, but that's still something to be thankful for. Or I may have come in contact with it, but I'm hopeful that I may not contract it. I think, we have to find the little things. Today, I was just thankful that I woke up on time to have a court hearing on the phone and get on here with you. That's what, if I do nothing else today, I've done it. So, but we're all struggling, and we have to recognize that we are, I think we need to change the term socially distanced. We are physically distanced.
That's right. That's
right. But we do not have to be socially distanced, whether it's a text, whether it's an email. One good thing is that I've gotten to sit down and talk to people, have Zoom meetings with people that I just did not have time before to do. I mean, I had a 3-hour conversation with one of my good lawyer colleague friends the other day. At no other time, but during this time, with either one of us have had 3 hours. So we're struggling, but we will be scarred, but hopefully we will not be destroyed.
Yeah, I think this time puts life into perspective, right? We were talking earlier about if we had known last year what this year would have brought, then we would have treated ourselves maybe a little bit differently.
Yes.
A little bit of grace. And so I'm looking at it from that lens as well. So I'm glad you have that perspective. So now let me get into the formalities, and I want you to kind of share more, but I want to give a little bit from your website. And really why I brought you on is because of the employment law piece. You really understand and represent those people who've had wrongful termination, sexual harassment around race, gender, age discrimination, discrimination based on ability. And so you also represent them in the contracts on the other end of that, or the beginning end, or even in the severance process as well. And so I thought this was the time where people are really making decisions about what's happening in the workplace, whether it's to stay in the environment that they're in, maybe it's toxic, maybe there are some toxic activities that are happening, or maybe they're looking to transition, pivot, move into another environment, and really want some information about how do I do that in a way that really honors and respects me, because now I realize I'm super valuable in the workplace. So before we get started, tell a little bit more about your practice. As you mentioned, you practice in Tennessee and in the DC area. You're a professor. Kind of give us a little bit of your bio so that the watchers.
I do too much. I do too much, but yes, I'm a Tennessee girl. So born and raised in Jackson, Tennessee. So Tennessee will always be home. I don't care what the law licenses say or what the degrees on the wall say. Tennessee is always home and always special to me. But I practice in Tennessee. I'm licensed in Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, Virginia, and DC District Court. I think that's where I'm licensed.
Yeah.
And I represent probably 80% of my work is I represent workers, and that's all workers from, restaurant workers, CEOs, medical professionals. I also represent small businesses, a little piece of my practice that I love, because so many of my small business owners are people who were either my clients when they were employees and decided for whatever reason to start their own. I love watching people's dreams come true. I love watching prayers be manifest. So I love it when somebody calls me and says, I think I want to start this business, but I'm still working, but I'll get back with you. And 6 months later, they call and say, I'm ready. So I love that. So I do that. And then I do general litigation. And I also am a professor. I teach human resources management at University of Maryland Global Campus. And other than that, I just do too much. I just buy shoes.
So, this time has reminded us maybe of a painful past, because some of this feels very much resemblant to times in our past. And it also is terrifying because it feels like an unfaithful future in some regards. And I'm curious about how this, what I call a dual pandemic, so COVID-19 and systemic racism, how has this time really shown up in the laws of justice, or in some cases, the laws of injustice? What's the conversations happening in the kind of back virtual hallways relative to discrimination, to just what's happening in our world right now, and of course, how it works within the workplace?
I mean, I think this entire thing just shed a light on, the first, just even talking about the pandemic, it shed a light on the systemic racism that exists in this country, in the world. And no, systemic racism did not cause the pandemic. No, the actual virus is not per se racist. So in other words, the virus doesn't float through the air saying, oh, there's a Black person. But the treatment we get from it definitely have some racial undertones, but that is nothing new. The medical community has had racial undertones and systemic racism for so long. And I was talking to somebody about this the other night, and they said, so are you telling me that doctors are racist? And I'm sure some doctors are racist, but I am not saying when you walk into a clinic and say, I want to be checked, or I'm having these symptoms. I'm not saying the doctor says, oh, that's Kia, she's Black, let's kill her. Right. But I am saying that you may walk in and a doctor may say, well, you're Black, you probably have asthma. That's why you're short of breath. It's probably not COVID. I had that happen to a client in April when this virus was somewhat new, but we knew enough about it. I was on the phone with her and she was having so much trouble catching her breath. And I said, hey, have you been checked for COVID? And she said, oh, I don't have it. And I said, oh, how do you know? And she said, oh, I went to the doctor. They said it's just asthma. And I said, okay, I haven't been to medical school, and I hate when people try to give me legal opinions, and I'm the one that went to law school. So I said, okay. And then we talked again, and she was still really struggling. And she said, I did go back, and they said, I'm having an anxiety attack because everybody's scared right now. And I said, well, go back one more time. And this was when testing wasn't widely available. And I said, go back one more time, and don't threaten them or anything, but just kind of mention that your lawyer is also your friend. and she was tested, and she did in fact have it. Spent a long time in the hospital. Gratefully she is okay today. But I do not think that the doctors, when she walked in, just said, we don't want this woman to have a good outcome because she's Black. But I just think certain underlying things. She was a young Black woman. She had not really advocated for herself, and that was the result. And so I think this pandemic has just shed a light on so many things that were probably invisible to some people. So for instance, the professions that were hard hit. The professions that are hard hit, the jobs that you are taking the most risk are those jobs where you have high contact with the public. Most of those jobs are low paying, and many of those jobs are occupied by Black and brown people. So it's not necessarily CEOs sitting in their offices with the door closed who are scared to go back to work. I'm not in my office now, and I will not be to 2021, but if I had to go, I would have really no problem because I sit in there with the door closed, and you can't come in unless I open the door for you. But it is the people who check us out when we go to the store. It is the person before you even get to the doctor, the person that takes your temperature, the person that checks you in at the desk, the person that swipes your insurance card, the person that takes your blood pressure. It is people in these professions who are being so highly impacted by this. And then the flip side is that it's also that demographic, largely Black and brown people who worked in professions that the industry has basically disappeared. So when you stayed in a hotel, and I always explain it to my students as the invisible professions, a lot of us don't think when we go stay at a hotel and go out and kick it for the day and come back and that room is clean. More than likely a Black or brown woman cleaned that room. And let me be very clear that this pandemic has just obliterated women in so many ways. It is women who have said, if I must take off work to homeschool the children. It is it has hit so many of those demographics so hard, and it's just really shined a light on the discrimination. The inherent discrimination is such a part of our fabric about this virus. And so, and it's spread too, you know, in the legal field. You know, I get so many calls from people saying, well, they did have layoffs at my job during the pandemic. They said it was because of money, but they only laid off, or rather they laid off a high proportionate number of Black people, or a high proportionate number of women, or a proportion of people that they thought had underlying conditions. And so it's just widespread, and it's not something, unlike the virus, we may not get a vaccine for racism, systemic racism, but we've got to do something to address it and at least know that it exists. Because if you know an illness exists, once we knew this virus existed, we started trying to do something about it. And we've got to do the same thing with systemic racism and discrimination, especially in the workplace, because people have to work.
They have to work. So what is that looking like, right? So you represent a lot of employees, and you're also representing some employers as well. On the employee side, what is that looking like? What's coming across your desk in terms of cases that you're seeing, cases of discrimination, cases of what might look like discrimination, what might feel like it, but isn't? Kind of talk us through just what's happening in real time in the workplace.
So by far, one of the biggest inquiries I'm getting these days is that my job is not taking precautions for COVID-19. By far, that's probably one of the biggest inquiries that I'm getting. I probably get 6 or 7 of those a couple of times a week, you know, a couple of days a week. Is my job didn't take precautions. My job knew that my colleague had COVID-19 and they didn't tell us. I am a CNA. I am a caregiver in a home, private caregiver, and my patient had COVID and the agency knew and did not tell me. What can I do? So that's by far one of the things. Of course, those inquiries are disproportionately Black and brown people because they work in these industries. So they're not necessarily race discrimination cases, but there is a racial undertone to it. So that's probably the biggest one that I'm getting now. And then I'm still getting the ones that I've gotten, you know, over the years, in that I'm being treated differently on the basis of my race. You know, with the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, with all the racial unrest, I'll have people call and say, hey, I wore my Black Lives Matter t-shirt today. And then the next day I got a write-up, but 2 weeks ago I got a great review. Or our job said no political symbols, but it's Black Lives Matter political. I wore my mask. I wore my Black Lives Matters mask. So we're dealing with those kind of issues because an entirely new world opened up this summer. The things that had been there, those of us who know, we know that these things had been there. There was no new. I had somebody say to me, oh, and now that there's discrimination, I'm like, now that there has been discrimination.
Come from under your rock. Yes, I have heard that a lot of times as well, which is probably the one of the most challenging things I'm hearing within my profession is people saying, you know, all of a sudden we have so many allies who are coming out saying, I just didn't know, I'm so sorry. But yet we are now kind of, because we're trying to normalize this experience, this trauma, now we're back to, you know, doing the same, what I call aggressive aggressions. I don't think they're very micro. We're still doing some very harmful things. I want to go back to something that you mentioned. Often people say, well, what's the response to this? And I say, well, this is my lawyer answer. I'm not a lawyer, but it depends. So I know that the question I'm going to ask is it depends. But when you mention in particular, because I've heard that as well, being in a job and being exposed to COVID, what is the right of an employee at that point? Is that a legal right? Is that a public health issue? Where do we point them? Not necessarily as, you know, this is 100% legal advice. But I want to make sure, I didn't do this in the beginning, to say that if you want to contact Phillis, you should, relative to being legal representation. This is not going to be, you know, don't take this to the court and say, this is what Rambsy Law told me. But I want to be able to give some real guidance around, you know, someone feeling unprotected in the workplace. What can they do?
So some workplace guidelines would be guided by things like OSHA or other laws. The other discrimination laws that we had prior to this pandemic have not disappeared. So Title VII, which prohibits discrimination on race, gender, religion, national origin, that's still in place. FMLA is still in place, Family Medical Leave Act. You know, there are certain criteria that you have to meet. But when we talk specifically about workplace rights and COVID. This disease is first so new. I know it does not feel like it because we are fatigued, but honestly, last year this time were the first rumblings of the disease, but it was a disease that we thought was overseas. So one of the issues with this disease is it is so highly contagious and so hard to pinpoint where you got it. So if you could prove 100%, I got this disease at work. However, the scenario that I give people, let's say that you do work at a grocery store and you don't think they're taking the proper precautions and you contract COVID. You may have gotten it at the grocery store, but let's say you take public transportation to get to work. You may have gotten it there. Let's say you have a child at home who's back in school. You may have gotten it from them. Let's say you have a spouse or a partner at home who works outside of the home. So can you really say, from what we know, I think, is a 5 to 14 day incubation period. So when on it did you get that? Did you get the disease? Can you really say that you got it? So that is going to be one of the hard things with bringing cases in the workplace, is that can we pinpoint it? Now, obviously, if we know a job is being negligent, so for instance, if you work somewhere and people are sneezing on the counter and your job is saying, we don't have time to wipe that up,
right?
Your job, then we may be able to pinpoint it more. But in so many instances, it's going to be hard to pinpoint it. And then you have to, anytime you bring a case, you have to prove that somebody violated either some standard of care or some law. And we have laws, for instance, those of us who live in Davidson County, we know we have a mask mandate. So we're supposed to wear a mask where we go, and businesses are supposed to require customers to come in. But there's not necessarily a federal law. In fact, we know that there is no federal mandate for mask wearing. There is not necessarily a law. And actually, there have been laws passed by some states, some local governments that protect employers and say, unless the employer was grossly negligent or committed misconduct, that they are immune or shielded from cases about contracting COVID-19. I think it's still a very new area. I think it's an area that, like anything, will grow, but it is still so new. And it feels so funny to say that because we are fatigued with this thing, but it's still so new.
Yeah.
And so it'll still, but I foresee cases coming up. Look at the Tyson chicken plant, where we know by the way that the plant is just set up that it was hard not to contract it. But then we now know that there's proof that managers were taking bets on who would get the virus. How disgusting is that?
Right. Wow.
So
I didn't know that.
like that, you may not be able to blame them for the workers contracting the virus, but surely there may be some liability for the misconduct. You're betting on this is a life, and you're betting on it.
Yeah. I certainly think that we have either we have lost the ability to have humanity, or we never had it. I haven't deciphered which one, and that is certainly indication. So if you work at the Tyson plant, know someone at the Tyson plant, please call Rambsy Law. And this is not necessarily a commercial for that, but it's to say, seriously, it's a matter of there are resources available, and I think that that's what. Sometimes when you're in these workplaces, because again, I get some of these calls or texts or DMs or messages that people say, I just don't know what to do, in particular when you need your job, right? I mean, none of us, even those who have our own, and we'll get to this in a moment, even those who have our own, stash of coins someplace, we still would like to work, right? We still don't want to be so without. So I want to go to the other part that you mentioned relative to kind of the Black Lives Matter, the politicism that we sometimes put into things that make us feel uncomfortable in the workplace. So we put anything that feels uncomfortable under the shield of politics or religion, so that way we kind of can push it off. What is the conversation, or how do we have the conversation in the workplace relative to racism, whether it be overt or covert? What does that really look like and mean? And how does someone bring about a case to say, I know that this is happening, this is discriminatory, or this is racist behavior, and I need to bring it forward someplace? Where do they take that information?
I think the problem that we've had is that people are so scared to use the actual language, but if it's in the water and it's waddling and it's got an orange beak, I'm calling it a duck. Right. And it's quacking at me, I'm calling it a duck. But so many places of employment have kind of danced around the issue. So even the laws, look at the law. The law does not prohibit racism on the basis of race, gender, religion. The law prohibits discrimination
Yeah, wow,
And
yeah.
so I always tell, when you use the word racist, people get so scared and say, I'm not racist, I'm not in the Klan, you know, I've never used the N-word. But I always tell people it's because we're looking at discrimination and racism as a stair with something on the bottom being the least and something at the top, when it's really a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, we have a cop that kneeled on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Yeah.
But on this end of the spectrum, we have a manager who's never used the N-word, who has some Black friends,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
but who is treating their Black employee differently. It's a spectrum. We hope that that manager will never get to this end of the spectrum and kneel on somebody's neck. But I think first we have to reframe the way we think about racism and discrimination, because the harm in oftentimes is still the same. The harm is sometimes death at the one end, but the harm is also economic harm. So when people lose their jobs and they get behind on bills and they get evicted and their kids don't have safe, you know, homes, and it becomes a cycle. So first, I think employers need to reframe the way that they think about it. You know, right after George Floyd's death, that next week, every company in the country and even in the world, when you went to their website, had a statement up. But is that statement, are you still living that statement now that we're months past it? So that's the first thing I think we have to reframe how we think about it. But until laws change, until the language is reframed, if you are somebody who's being discriminated against, you also have to learn to use the language of the law to empower yourself. And so you have to learn to say that, not my boss doesn't like me, because you don't have to like anybody. There is no law that says you have to like your employees. There is no law. I always say I won't say the word on here because we're live, and my parents are actually watching and they already say I talk bad and talk nasty. So
I was gonna say, listen, let's get into it. You know, our conversations with kids, we want to get real. But okay, we will respect the Rambsy family.
Well, they know I say it. They just hate that other people know I say it. But I will say that there is no law that prevents somebody from being, that prohibits somebody from being an asshole. Like, you can be an asshole and that's legal. Yeah. You cannot be an asshole and only be an asshole to one race of people or one gender of people. Yeah. And so I think we have to, when you're making a complaint, I'll have so many clients make complaints, or they'll come to me and I'll say, did you complain? And they'll say, yeah, I went to the supervisor and said my boss just didn't like me. And I'll say, so? Now, you don't have to say I said my boss is racist, because as I said, once you say that word, you kind of tune people out. And I'm not at all advocating for not being honest, not walking in your truth, but you do have to learn to speak the language that people will listen to. So yes, I believe that I've been subjected to adverse actions on the basis of my race. I believe that my employment conditions changed once I became pregnant. I believe that once I was over 60 years old, that I started to be subjected to things that I did not get. Or the younger employees have an advantage or have opportunities for. So you have to use the language. One way to use the language, and of course I'm biased, but talk to an attorney. And you know, so many people think that you only talk to me, you only talk to an attorney when you're ready to sue. Okay. I do sue people, but that's only a little bit of what I do. Right. I always tell people sometimes a consultation is worth it just for peace of mind. Yeah. You know, I go to my general practitioner every year. I go to my gynecologist every year. I go to my dentist twice a year. I go to the cardiologist twice a year, and I don't get surgery any of the times I go. I go for consultation if something has changed in the year. I go so I'll know what to look for if something happens, and I go for peace of mind. So when my doctor pricks my finger and calls the next day and says your blood tests were fine, that's my peace of mind. And you have to look at attorneys like that. You don't have to be ready to sue. Oftentimes, if you come to me when it's time to sue, it's not obviously too late because we can't sue on your behalf, but there may have been some things that we could have worked out. If you know that there's a target on your back, if you come to me before you get terminated, maybe we can work out a severance where you all just agree to part ways rather than getting fired, having no money at all, and having to wait for the court to wind its way through the court system. So learn to speak the language. If you don't speak the language, talk to somebody who does. Yeah. Those of us who've traveled outside of the country know that when we go to countries where we don't speak the language, we hook up with somebody. Hey, I want to order this in the restaurant. I don't know how to say it in French. You know, I was on a layover in Paris a few years ago, and I had a terrible headache, and I don't speak French at all. And I could not communicate that what I needed was high milligram ibuprofen. I didn't need just a little. And so I approached somebody who I saw speaking English, but I heard them speaking French too. And I said, I need the high, like, and so I went to somebody that spoke the language because I was in pain and I had somebody else have to communicate that pain to others.
Yeah.
For me.
That's good.
And so I think attorneys, what we do is we help you speak the language. We help you write the language because it is unfortunate. And again, I am not saying don't walk in your truth or don't be honest. But when you go to that supervisor and say, my boss is racist, people hear the word racist and they shut down. They shut down. They don't hear anything you say after that. And so if you want me to say it in your language, I will. You know, it's discriminatory. It's adverse actions. And I've been damaged.
No, and I think that's the piece that an employer is not banking on, right? They're not banking on that you taking a step back from whatever the action is, going to sit down, write it out, and put those things into either writing or just come up with your own words based on what they've heard. So I hope that you listened. I like that one. The adverse actions. I mean, I'm going to use that one in something. But if you didn't catch it, then catch the replay so that you can hear what Phillis is talking about. Pushing a little bit forward. Of course, also make sure that you like this video, share it with other people, and then put comments below. Ask your questions below if you have a question. If you're in a situation where you really want to, you have a pressing and burning question, put those below. Let's flip over just a little bit. So we talked a little bit about employees. Let's talk about employers. You know, what should, and you've given good advice so far, and you've given us some guidance, but what should employers really be thinking about? What should they be doing? We're in a time where, as you mentioned, we're on this spectrum of people saying, but I'm not one of those, meaning I'm not a bad person. I don't discriminate based on age. I don't care that you are part of the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, I love everyone, right? We're in this place of that. We're also in a place of communal trauma where people are absolutely traumatized and trying to find normalized ways to operate in the world. And so when you're trying to do that, then sometimes you go back to the who you are normally, which is not to be all loving and care about my Black humanity or someone's rights within their orientation. So what are you advising some of your employers to be thinking about, to really be mindful in how they can protect their employees and be most careful about how they walk through this world that we're living in, COVID-19, the racism that we have, the deaths that are literally happening almost daily, the injustices that Black folks are particularly watching every day? How are you advising them to honor their truth, honor the truth of the experiences of their employees?
I always tell employers, even if they're not my client, usually I'm telling an employer this when I represent an employee and we're at the mediation table or at the deposition table before trial or something. Communication is key. No, it is key. Communicate. You are a communication expert. I'm always shouting you out on Instagram. I'm copying and pasting your stuff. Like, oh, that's a good line to say. But communication is so key. People think, oh, we could never be racist because we have a diverse workforce. And in fact, we have the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So we've done it all. We ordered some sandwiches in, you know, it's great. We called Kia in. She did 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And great. We are great. If we go to court, we're just going to play the video of Kia and we're going to win our case. But communication is key. And I understand companies are all different sizes. You have different talents in the company, and most companies exist to make money. So you have to do that job. Yeah. But you can also communicate. You know, I was telling you before we went live, and I use this example so often, that I had a client come to me and she said she was discriminated against because she was pregnant. And I asked her, you know, what is some of the documentation, or tell me what happened? And she said, oh, when I announced my pregnancy, nobody said congratulations. Okay. Well, in her mind, that meant they weren't happy for her to be pregnant. Yeah. Flip that, I actually was able to talk to the employer, and they said, we didn't want to make a big deal out of it because we did not want her to think we were singling her out for being pregnant. So we didn't ask every day, how are you feeling? Yeah. Because if we did, she would have said, I'm pregnant and you don't think I can do my job. So communication is key. A lot of times companies have to make decisions, and hard decisions. And I'm not saying that you have to violate confidentiality or tell all the secrets, but a lot of times just letting people know, hey, we're going to have layoffs because it's a pandemic and we lost 50% of our revenue. And this is how we made the decision to have layoffs. So I think communication is key. Listening Not only to the big things. Again, a lot of people only recognize racism or what they call discrimination if it's something big. So most of us, I don't care what your political affiliation was, what your race is, most of us recognize that what happened to George Floyd was tragic. And a lot of people even recognize that it was racist, because it was.
Right.
But we don't recognize the little things. And so somebody will say, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. I just told Kia she was articulate. But you don't tell the white employee that they are articulate. Or I've had people that when they learn I have more than one law license, or I'll make the statement, oh, I've taken 4 bar exams. And people will say, it's a shame you didn't pass on the first time. No, I took 4 and passed all 4 on the first time.
Right. 4 different states. Yeah.
Right. They automatically assume that. So I would say communication also involves listening to what people say and then really hearing what they say. You know, all of us have some form of privilege, or most of us have some form of privilege. And check your privilege. I always check my privilege. So when I have a client come to me and I'll say, well, what is your lost wages? You know, what were you making? I made the mistake a few weeks ago. It was a client and they were a lower wage earner. And I said, oh, they made just blank amount. And so that was my privilege, saying that it's an amount that I would want to make more than, or I didn't think it was a lot or a lot of money, but that was still my privilege, my discrimination against somebody saying you make just this. That just was paying their bills. That just was putting food on their kids' table. And so I think employers have to listen and know what they are listening to. And when an employee tells you something, of course, sometimes it's not going to actually be discrimination. Of course, sometimes you may just have a disgruntled employee. But listen, have you really researched it? Have you in good faith done the investigation? Do you know things that are not explicit discrimination? Do you know code words, what we call dog whistles? Right. We know what it means when somebody tells us we're articulate. Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying when you say, oh, you're so articulate. You look good for a Black person or for a dark person. You're really, oh, wow. Nobody in your family's in jail? Nobody.
Or who taught you that? That's something that I've had. Like, who exactly taught you that? It's like, well, my parents. Okay.
Right.
They both live in the same place. You know, it's all of those little pieces. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think employers have got to listen, got to understand what they are hearing when they listen, and have to think of it as part of the company mission and the company profit. Because I would rather see you put education into a good diversity education program, into a good anti-discrimination program, than spend your money defending the case. So who are the experts out here who are talking to it? Can you get them on Zoom? You know, you really don't have an excuse now. So maybe before you could say, oh, we can't fly Kia to California from Nashville, but you can log on to Zoom. And so those are the kind of things that companies are going to have to do. They're going to have to recognize that it costs an investment, that it is an investment. Companies with different levels of employees have to look at who are employees that may fall into a certain demographic. You know, so if you run a hotel company, yes, talk to your salespeople should not be subject to discrimination, but it'll be a different kind of discrimination that your janitors and your custodians may be exposed to. So what are you doing? How are you listening? And what messages are you communicating? What are you rewarding in your company? Yeah. You know, the person is always getting promoted, that person that we know if we were meeting in person at the company convention, that we know is going to say something. All of us got that. We've all worked with that person. We know at the holiday party, at the summer cookout, they're going to have 2 or 3 drinks, and it's going to be a little racist what they say, but it's really more than, or they're going to touch somebody inappropriately and laugh, but they're steady getting promoted. So even when you're not saying something, you're saying something. How does the leadership at your company look? If I'm coming to an interview with your company and I click on the website, everybody in control, if they look a certain way, you already know that you don't value me, or you don't value people who look like me. Unless, you know, we couldn't find anybody. It's not, we're over that.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to note that you did something in this just modeling that I think is important, where you just took ownership of a misstep that you made. And very often employers are sometimes not willing to even do that, because if I do that, then I'm seen as weak, or I don't have my leadership position, or I'm too vulnerable. So I appreciate that you understood that you made that misstep with your client, and that we all have the potential to do it, right? None of us are exempt from a potential situation that can be harmful to someone else, even if it wasn't our intention, which doesn't mean that the action on the other side wasn't harmful.
Right. The action is the same. You know, if I go out of here driving drunk and hit somebody in your family, or if I just make a mistake and hit them, the bottom line is somebody in your family is hurt.
Right.
And while intent does matter under some laws, you have to show an intent. As you said, the harm, it does not. And that's one thing I think is really hard, is that we've been taught not to say sorry. We don't. And even as an attorney, I will admit, I'll sometimes tell people, don't say you're sorry, because they may think that's an admission of liability. But we've been taught that even when you have when you settle a case, the first provision says that this settlement is not an admission of wrongdoing.
Right.
So we are scared to go back and say, I messed up, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought this. I was just thinking in my little world. I didn't know. We're so scared to say we are sorry, because we think that means that it's an admission of liability, or we look weaker. And some people just hate to be wrong. And so you have to say it sometimes. We got that wrong. We got that. You know, we got that. I've gotten a few things wrong. I've had staff to get things wrong before, and I always try to go back and correct it. I think the other thing, we're also wrapped up in our worlds, is that, and we keep forgetting that companies are companies, but companies are run by people, and people are flawed.
Yes. Absolutely.
So Walmart didn't hurt you.
Yeah.
The person in leadership or your supervisor at Walmart hurt you. But because we are all people, all of us come with our certain set of ideas, morals. So I may think different than you think. And you may think different than someone else thinks. And that oftentimes manifests as discrimination, because we are so attracted to things and people who are like us.
Yeah.
So the Ivy League people hang with the Ivy League people.
Sure.
You know, I did a Zoom with some people the other day, and it's about 8 people on the screen, but one person had a Spellman screensaver.
Okay.
Hey, who are you? Turn your camera on. I want to see you. Because I went to Spellman. So when I can spot a Spellman sign a mile away. And so I think we have to recognize that we are privileged. And when I say we, I'm saying people that run companies, people who are in decision-making positions. We have a certain amount of privilege. Even if we belong, I'm in a marginalized group, but I still have a certain amount of privilege. I make decisions every day on who I'm going to hire, who's going to get a certain amount of money, who I'm going to interact with. And I'm always trying to check my privilege and say, I may have been raised like this, but it doesn't mean it was the right way, or rather a better way than someone else was raised. And I think we have to start there. Check the way I just, in the beginning, I said, say something you're thankful for every day. Every day, say, this is how I'm privileged. And this is how it may play out in my position of power.
Yeah, acknowledgement. I mean, going back to communication, acknowledgement is such an important part, particularly for Black employees. But any person who kind of dangles in the margins, they're just looking for acknowledgement that they are valuable. And when you say something like what you just mentioned as your affirmation for the day, I'm grateful that I have these privileges, but I also recognize that I have them and that I'm not to use them to harm anyone else. That affirmation alone would be really helpful to implement within your workplace. So I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. I want to do maybe one more kind of legal piece of this, because sometimes with clients, when I go in to do a workshop or develop a curriculum or do some anti-racism training, I'll say, do you want to manage this here? You want to manage this in with EEOC or the court of law, like where you want to manage it. And so I want to really talk about what EEOC is, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Who are they? What are they? How do people use them? And I mostly want people to understand that may or may not be your go-to, but you just should know what their role is and if there is an issue that comes up in the workplace. So how would you guide someone through what the EEOC is?
Right. So the EEOC is a federal agency, and as part of their mission, I can't repeat it verbatim, but it is to enforce, anti-discrimination laws. I think a lot of people hear the enforce and they think if I call the EEOC, they're going to storm in my job and arrest everybody and get me a check. And unfortunately, that's not the case. One, because like any other agency, federal agency, they have a limited number of people who work there. For instance, there is not an EEOC office in every city. In Tennessee, we have 2. We have one in Nashville and one in Memphis.
Mhm.
And they handle all the cases, not only in Tennessee, but also some in Arkansas, in the Arkansas region as well. But the EEOC, for some laws, you have to file a charge at the EEOC first before you can. So for instance, Title VII, you can't just run into court and file the Title VII lawsuit. You have to file it at the EEOC. An investigation has to take place, or mediation may take place if both parties agree to mediation. And then the EEOC will give you something called a right to sue letter. And then you have a right to sue in court. I am a big proponent of never rushing into anything. Now, having said that, I'm also a big proponent of not sitting on your rights. But what I mean by that is sometimes, again, after talking to somebody that speaks the language and an attorney, maybe there will be a different strategy that you can resolve the case. If you have to go to the EEOC, or if the deadline is approaching, don't just say, oh, it'll get better. You go. But so many people will rush. I'll have so many people call me and say, I just filed at the EEOC today. And then I'll read the charge they filed, and it doesn't really articulate what happened, or it doesn't on paper look like they were discriminated against. It'll say, my manager doesn't like me and I got fired because they don't like me. And of course, if that's all the information you give the EEOC, they're ultimately going to say, well, no discrimination took place. And maybe from what we read on your paper, it didn't take place. So the EEOC, though, is not an enforcement agency in the sense that they can force an employer to do something. And a lot of people will use the language, the EEOC is going to make them pay me. No, if the EEOC finds that discrimination existed, they will try to do what's called a conciliation process, which tries to get the parties to work it out. Even before then, right after you file the charge, the EEOC will encourage the parties to mediate it. Well, they will offer mediation. But if both parties don't agree to it, there is no mediation. So I want people to know that the EEOC is a helpful organization that you can go to. And in fact, it's a required organization that you have to file certain claims through, but it is not your only option, meaning that talk to an attorney, see if there's some other strategy to work it out. Having said that, don't sit on your rights. I get so many people who say, well, you know, this started 3 years ago and I thought it would get better and I prayed about it and it hasn't gotten better. And I got fired 2 years ago. Well, the deadline is up.
Okay.
You know,
how long do you have? How long do you have to be able to file something?
So if there is a state or local agency, you have 300 days. If there is no state or local agency, you have 180 days.
Wow. Okay.
So I always try when I can to file under the 180 days, just because, you know, things can happen. So even if I have contacted an employer and they're trying to work with me, but if we haven't signed on the dotted line, I'll call up the employer again, communication. I'll call up and say, hey, you're going to get a charge from the EEOC. It's not because we're backing out or trying to settle, but the deadline is coming. I know that we've talked on the phone and on paper, we have something, but it's not settled yet. So to preserve my client's rights, I need to go on and file. But as soon as I file, I'm going to call you back and we're still going to try to settle this thing, and then I'll withdraw it. So many people, the most heartbreaking thing to me is when somebody comes to me and they have a quote unquote good case, but they've waited too long.
Yeah.
I had a woman tell me last week, well, I went to my job and they said it would get better, so I just didn't do anything. The deadline was up.
Yeah. I mean, what that speaks to really is the history of trauma that we have experienced. I have a book that I kind of constantly pick up, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and it really speaks about that trauma over generations since slavery to now, and how we really adopted or adapted that behavior of just, I think it'll get better, that hopefulness, which is important, right? We are faithful people. It's important for us to hang on to that. It's also important, as you mentioned, to have faith and to go through the proper channels of law. So you can pray as you walk towards the office. Or
faith without works. Faith without works is dead. You know, I tell everybody, I'm hopeful when I get in my car that I will not be in a car wreck.
Absolutely.
I pray that I would not be in a car wreck, but I put my seatbelt on.
Absolutely.
I'm hopeful at night that no one will break in.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that I live in a good neighborhood, but at night I lock my doors and I close the windows and lock the windows. Yeah. And you're so right that traumatic, particularly for Black people, for people of color, it's traumatic. It's having always been left out. It's blaming the victim. So we don't want to say anything because they'll think we're troublemakers. We don't want to say anything because the next person may not get a job. We don't want to say anything because, and I get it, I get it. We have to work. We have to work, and you have to put food on the table and pay for so many things. But you have to determine what are your non-negotiables. And I tell every client that your physical and mental health to me are your non-negotiables. And when you start saying, I can't breathe, literally, I'm having anxiety at night. I've lost 20 pounds. I'm now having mental health issues. That's a rough spot to be in. And you may have to determine that there's something else that you can do. And I say, always be ready. That's not that you're always looking for trouble.
Yeah.
But always, no job owes you anything. They do owe you to follow the law. But the example I always use is the speed limit around my house is also 25. Right. Obligation to follow it. I hope nobody's watching this who's going to come give me a ticket when I get out of here today, but I often do not go 25. I'm not going to say what neighborhood I live in, so nobody will come looking for me, but that is the law. The law says that we are supposed to file taxes on April 15th. It's a whole lot of people who don't do that. And so people will say, but they can't fire me for being Black because it's the law. But people break the law all the time, and you have to be ready, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Keep your skills up. So if you have to go to another place, I know it's very hard to save money. And I told Kia this before, but before I owned my own company, and now more so, I kept an account called Kiss My Ass account. And it is the bank account that if I ever have to say I'm out of here, kiss it. It is the account that I hope will give me a cushion until I get where I need to be. And it didn't start off with $1 million. The way I started my Kiss My Ass account is I'd had a bad day at work one day. And I used to always, on my drive home from work, I would probably a few times a week stop at this one bar, and I would always order 2 Manhattans. That's my favorite cocktail in Manhattan. I would always order 2 Manhattans. They were about $15 or $16. And I'd had an extremely bad day at work one day. I went to the bar. I ordered a Manhattan. I was drinking it, and the bartender came and said, "Do you want another one?" And I said no. And at that moment, I went online and started an online bank account, and I transferred $15 into it. And I still do that every day. Yet the other day, somebody asked me for $100, and I was going to give it to them. I gave them 80, and I put the 20 into that account. So I do that. If I want 2 pair of shoes, it may be something that's, something big, as in I was going to buy a car, but I'm putting the money here. But it doesn't have to be huge. It can be, I was going to get 2 pair of shoes. They were $100 a piece. I'm going to put 100 in, or I was going to get 2 appetizers, or I was going to get takeout tonight from, a delivery company. It was going to be $40. Put that in the account, but be prepared, be proactive. Yes, employers have to follow the law. Yes, law enforcement is supposed to follow the law, but there's also an onus on us to do some things. There are some things that we cannot control, but there are some things that we can. Learn a skill. There were so many industries that were supposedly recession proof, and they are recession proof, but they were not pandemic proof.
Right. Yeah.
And so I just think about the people, who said, there's always money in this industry. And then most that industry did not exist anymore. And so we have to, I'm a big proponent of knowing your rights, getting somebody to help enforce your rights, but also being so proactive on those things that you can change and challenge.
Yeah, I love, and I hope that after this, I'm trying to think about what I need to buy and then what I cannot buy and put to a fund I do it. But I like that, right? I like the idea of, it's really about self-discipline. It's really about putting yourself first and having the discipline to continue to do that. It's an active affirmation as well. We walk through life sometimes very zombied, and in particular, we can do that now because we're literally going from our room, one room in our house to the next room in our house, or, as you mentioned, I can't remember on the caller before, what all the things you got to grab, we're used to just grabbing our keys and running. And that's how kind of robotic we have been. And now we're having to remember, like, I got to get my Lysol, I got to get my wipes, I've got to get my mask, all of that. But this really is a time for you to make some different decisions, to know that you are valuable in these work environments. And it's not just that they are valuable to you, that you are valuable as well to them. So I really hope that people pay attention to that bit of advice relative to money and putting that Kiss My Ass account together is so important. But you mentioned something I want to really just kind of like 1, 2, 3 it. What could be those steps? So today somebody, walks into their workplace and or is on a Zoom call or what have you, and there is something that feels very discriminatory. Not even feels, but it's like everybody experiences it at the same time. And I've heard that the N word was used, or something has happened. It felt very blatant. What are maybe the 1, 2, 3 steps that they should do before they call you, before they call the EEOC, before they get really mad, get on social media? Like, what should they do kind of within themselves so they can process that and have their adequate materials for you or for that claim as they proceed to move forward?
First, document. Not only, you're not documenting for proof in court later or to show something in court, but you're documenting so it can be fresh in your mind. Mm-hmm. You talk a lot about trauma, and trauma makes us forget, or it makes us remember incorrectly.
Correct.
And so if an example of that, if any of us can think of the day that somebody very important in our lives died, you probably remember that day very differently than it actually happened. Yeah. And so first, document. If you're on a Zoom call, if you have a meeting with your supervisor, something happens at work, and you don't have to pull out your notebook in front of them and say, I'm writing down, but when you get back to your office, when you disconnect from the Zoom call, just write yourself some notes. Write them in a notebook, on your phone, in the notes. Just, this is what happened, as accurately as possible, and if possible, as quickly in a short amount of time from when the accident happened or incident happened, because we know the longer the time goes, our minds we have other things to think about. Mm-hmm. So first, document, and then ask yourself the question, what do I want from this?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Am I documenting it to report it and hope the company gets better? Is it an incident that caused me to lose some money or even lose my job? Mm-hmm. So secondly, ask, what do I want from this? And then third, who can help me get that? Mm-hmm. Is it the supervisor? Is it an attorney? Is it maybe a mentor? But document, ask yourself what you want from it, and ask who can help me get that, or who can help me plan to get that. And then when you have those things, if you have to go talk to an attorney, you already have it where you can say, hey, I wrote this down, even though it happened 2 months ago, I wrote this down 30 minutes after it happened. So this is as accurate as it's going to get. So that helps me if you're coming to me saying, oh, okay, this is what you help. Think about other things after you document, think about, have any other similar things happen? Was this just a one-off where, the week leading up to the election, I was getting so many calls because people were, I actually did not take meetings the week up to the election. And actually when we didn't call it on Tuesday night, I took no meetings that whole week because I work with all kind of people, and people had all different feelings. And, I would be on a Zoom and see somebody in their background would have a political organization in the background that I didn't quite agree with. And I was supposed to be in the meeting. I would, yeah. So think about those things outside, but document, ask yourself, what do you want from this, or what do you want to accomplish from that? And then who can help me accomplish that?
Yeah, no, that's really 1, 2, 3. That's super solid. And I know that there were a few folks who were going to get on who said they were prepared to maybe, contact you, get in touch with the EEOC because of some things that have been happening. And to your point, they've been happening so often, or so much more often, because we're all experiencing trauma in very different ways and how it shows up. And so it's really important that we address that.
And I think I like that you talk about trauma, because we are experiencing trauma, but meaning Black people are experiencing trauma, but other people are experiencing trauma, and justified or not, people's perspective is their reality.
Yeah.
And so other people experience trauma and we're experiencing trauma, and then we clash. I had this incident, and I'm going to blog about it when I get some time, as if I have some time, but I did not go to my office. I have not been to my office since March. I went the first time in August. Mm-hmm. And you know what building my office is in. And so before the pandemic, we didn't have a sign-in policy. You could just walk in our building, get on the elevator, go where you need it. Well, since the pandemic, there is, that'll help things like contact tracing or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I walk in the building, and a security guard yells at me and says, you better sign in. And so I documented it quickly in my head. And then I tried to say, okay, I did walk by the desk. Let me see if anything else is going on. So I walked by, people who did not look like me were just walking in and not signing in. So I asked him about it. And Long story short, he threatened to call the police on me for questioning him. This was in August after George Floyd's murder. And so we know what that means when you threaten to call the police. And my situation turned out okay. You know, I ended up filing a complaint with the building. Lots of people got behind me. But one thing that I kept noting, I said that the security guard had no idea that I'm somebody who represents people like him.
Yeah.
I am somebody who fights so hard for workers. When this pandemic started, I was fighting so hard that the job, you need to buy them a mask. The law doesn't say you do, but you need to buy them a mask. You need to tell people to step back from your security guards. You're putting them at risk. But his trauma, and who knows what he had gone through, who knows how long he'd been working, why he was working. But it hit me that I was already traumatized from things going on. I know what it means when you say, I'll call the police. Yeah. He had probably had some trauma going on in his life where he just said, I know what calling the police can do. I'll call the police. And so two traumas clashed. We never were able to work it out on ourselves. We had to go higher up. But oftentimes, even in jobs, even in different situations, you know, you'll have somebody who refuses you for a promotion because they're scared that you actually are talented. Yep. And you actually may rise up. That's their trauma. That's their insecurity. And so I think we need to recognize that. I'm not saying we have to sit down with everybody and sing "We Shall Overcome" and hold hands or like everybody, but recognize that, because often understanding somebody else's trauma is a part of your strategy. Yeah. So when I talk to certain people, I know what triggers them. So I either use that for my advantage, and I don't mean in a bad way. If I know that saying the word beer triggers Kia and I'm trying to do business with Kia, I'm not going to invite you for beer. I'm not going to say beer. At the same time, if I know I could use it differently, if I know that's a weak spot for you, if I know you drink beer and say yes to everything, if I'm trying to get you to sign a contract for less money, I'm like, Kia, let me buy you a beer. So understand other people's trauma, understand that you have a perspective, but other people, but above all, you know, walk in your truth. I can't tell anybody, go quit your job, because you cannot come stay with me. I am sorry.
Right. Hello, yeah.
But walk in your truth, develop your skills, be the best you. I know that sounds so elementary. That's what they used to tell us in grammar school. Be the best you, but really be the best you so you can have choice. There is nothing greater. And Kia, you actually told me this when you used to represent me. You said you will know that you're doing something right when you can turn down clients or turn down work. And I just think, you know, when you can get to that point where you can say, you don't have to put me on the schedule. Yep. I'm good. You don't have to be my client. I'm good. That's a wonderful place to be at, but it's about knowing your rights and fighting for your truth.
Yeah, the greatest power is walking away. People will find, you know, they will find a place to work, how to work with you. They'll be super nice to you. They'll be, because what you're showing them really is a different way to manage or navigate that trauma, because we're all in it, right? So then I'm showing you that I have overcome something to get to that point.
And you're telling them you don't have a certain amount of control over me. Again, there are certain things when I wake up every day I cannot control. I cannot control this virus. Yeah. You know, I cannot control the economy. Yeah. I cannot control if it's going to be a recount in some states or not. Mm-hmm. But I can control exposing myself to the virus. Yep. I can control my own economic abilities to an extent by saving money. Mm-hmm. I can control the work that I do, the people that I work for. I can control the invitations that I take. Yep. And I think we have to, there's some things we cannot control, but those things you can control, you should hold on to them so tight and control them. Because as you say, you teach people how to work with you. Yeah. It is. I loved when I emailed you a few weeks ago and said, hey, I may have a client for you. You said, if I can fit them in, I will. If not, I'll send them somewhere else. That's power.
We got to just know where we are, right? So one last question, because I know that your time is super limited and you have allowed me so much of it.
I'm going to get whiskey after this. It's middle of the day.
Good. Okay, good. For all of our amazing viewers and listeners and watchers of this. So just to I want to make sure people are really mindful of, we're going into, we have some vaccinations that are coming online relative to COVID-19. And you and I were talking offline about the potentialities that can happen in the workplace relative to that vaccination. Of course, you don't know what everybody's going to do, but I do want to talk about that. Like, what is a person's right relative to, you work a place who might require that you or mandate that you have that vaccination? what is your right within that? And you may not have no rights, but I just want people to know, keep that in mind so that as it starts to come down the pipeline, they're ready for whatever the next step is for them in their journey.
So to a large extent, your employer, particularly your private employer, can require you to get the vaccination. I mean, and that's nothing new.
Right.
We're talking about the COVID-19 vaccine will be new, but vaccinations are nothing new. Years ago, it was the flu shot. People were saying, I don't want to get the flu shot. So to a large extent, they can require you. There are certain exceptions. They can infringe on your religious views, or, you know, they can't make only the women get it. We saw this probably last with the Zika virus. And so many jobs were telling women, particularly because, you know, it was, they were saying that it really was impacting pregnant women. And so a lot of jobs were saying, don't travel. Or if you travel, show us this. But to a large extent, you know, jobs will be able to require you to get vaccinations. And so we need to start thinking now about, will you get the vaccination? What will you do if you don't want to get it? But you know, it's nothing new, the requirement of vaccines. If you travel internationally, you know that many countries require you, for instance, most places in South America and Africa require you to have a yellow fever vaccination. I've had a yellow fever vaccination. Was it rough? It absolutely was, but I also wanted to go to Africa. So I wanted to go to Ghana. So I got it. I just had to get another one a few years ago because I lost my documentation. So, you know, those are things that you need to start talking to your family about. That you need to even start asking your employer now, because the time to have it is, the discussion is not the day that the employer sends out the memo. I would actually, at the next staff meeting or anything, I would raise my hand and say, hey, as the vaccine becomes more widely available, is our office going to require, is our employer going to require us to have it? We do know that most people who work in the medical profession, their jobs probably will absolutely require them to have it. But there will be other jobs. I'm really interested in if there will be a push to make teachers get it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that people were mindful of that as they're going into this next phase, so they can begin to either make pivots relative to their journey in the workplace, or they can just be more proactive. So any last things you need to tell us, any other fun things? I know you're about to go get your whiskey. Encourage people to go to RamsyLaw.com. Make sure they find you on all the social platforms. But anything else that people should absolutely know before we get off?
Just, you know, stay safe during this time. Recognize that there is a mental health crisis and all of us are impacted. All of us are impacted. I know I laugh and joke and you and I have a good time, and I hope we'll have many more good times, but we are impacted. Our mental health has taken a hit. You know, we woke up almost basically one day in March and life had changed. I think of the people that I told in March, hey, I'll see you the beginning of March before everything shut down. I think of people I was visiting and said, hey, see you next week. And next week has not come. We have lost people and it has not hit us yet because we have not been in the groups where we would usually be. So members of your church may have died, but you have not been to church. So you won't know that until you go next year and sister so-and-so is not in her usual seat. So recognize that it's a mental health crisis. We are not in a normal time. So it so irritates me when people say, let's get back to normal. We're not. What's normal about this? So give yourself space to grieve. Give yourself space to mourn is what I would say. And recognize that also this time is probably impacting every decision that you are making and every action that you're making. So I think I've had an increase in calls because people are traumatized. We're more sensitive now. So something that you would have brushed off last year, if you lost your job last year, the economy was doing okay. You probably could have just walked down the street and got another one. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, if you were a server in a restaurant last year in Nashville, you could have walked anywhere, but now restaurants have cut back, they've cut staff. And so people, if they lose the job they have or are having trouble, they want to enforce their rights even more. So recognize that this time has hit every aspect of our being, our jobs, our financial aspect, our families, our personal relationships. But as I said at the beginning, also let your humanity know that we got some hope. You know, and everything you do, you got some hope. Make a vision board, or whatever you do, make a vision board, write down. I got another bank account called my travel account when the pandemic is over. And I'm balling on it. You know, I used to selectively fly first class, depending on how long I fly first class everywhere when this is over. You won't be seeing me flying first class like to Jackson from Nashville.
That's right. I mean, I love that. And I love, you know, you said so many important nuggets. I always take a whole lot of notes during this time. even though I can watch the replay and stuff, I just love it in real time because I like to be able to say, well, Phyllis said. But one of the things that you just said that I want to kind of end on is next week has not come. And so I think about that relative to next week may not come. And whatever it is that you're supposed to do with your life or your work or your career or your family, do it now because next week may not come. And we saw that really when we shut down. This is my first conversations with Kia.
Do it more often.
And this was why I knew I had to come up with something so I could talk to the amazing Phillis Rambsy, and I'm so glad that you did that. Please find her online. You can find me online, kiajarmon.com. But tune in next time. I'll come up with another topic and another great friend to have conversation with. So thank you for being with me, Phyllis.
Thank you, Kia. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone. Be safe. Mask up.
Mask up.